Thank you to our witnesses for being here. We know that United States leadership in NATO is essential to our own national security. We must support our European allies as they take meaningful steps to ensure and increase their own defense spending and capabilities. And we cannot pull away and isolate ourselves as the current Republican administration seeks. Maintaining a strong leadership role in NATO means standing up to the biggest threat facing our European allies, Russia's aggression. But Republicans on this very committee remain silent as Donald Trump scolds our NATO allies, parrots Putin's talking points, and retreats on the global stage. As Russian attacks are stepping up, Trump is stepping back. He's not lifting a finger to support Ukraine in their fight for freedom, sovereignty, and security. And Russian aggression towards our allies can be seen in their sabotage of essential underwater technologies and infrastructure. At least 11 undersea cables in the Baltic Sea have been damaged since October 2023, including cables disrupting essential energy and internet services to our allies in Finland and Sweden. Ambassador Smith, could you explain how NATO is countering attacks against undersea infrastructure, and how can the U.S. support this work and protect our own underwater infrastructure from this sabotage?
Thank you, Representative, for raising this particular issue. The clippings of or cutting of undersea cables is increasingly a topic of conversation across the NATO alliance, and allies have increased their surveillance, particularly in the Baltic Sea. They're sharing more intelligence, sharing best practices, and putting together a toolkit that will enable the alliance to fortify itself to these types of hybrid tactics. This is an area where U.S. leadership is indispensable, and if we continue to work through this particular issue through NATO, we'll see a stronger collective alliance response to these types of incidents.
Thank you. And this is an example where our adversaries, especially China, are watching NATO's response to Russia's aggression. Our response, our collaboration, our refusal to retreat from this task is a signal that I think is incredibly important. And this is emblematic of the response that we need to have to the increased coordination and cooperation between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, as they of course form a significant threat against Ukraine and NATO. And so China's continued investments in critical infrastructure and telecommunication systems, in particular across Europe, raises alarms about this coordination. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about how NATO can and should counter the combined threat of coordination between those actors, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, especially with the investment from China in critical telecommunication systems.
Well, this is actually a remarkable bipartisan story, and I guess there's not as many of those these days as we would all wish. But in the Trump administration's first term, they pushed the alliance to conduct a China review that put China on the map and got allies talking about what China's doing in and around Europe. The Biden administration grabbed the baton. We were able to get China into NATO's strategic concept, deepen our partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and now handed the baton back to the second Trump administration. My hope is that this administration will continue to run down this path to heighten allies' awareness of what China is doing in Europe, whether it's economic coercion, disinformation, or fueling and helping supply Russia's war in Ukraine.
And I think it's so important there that you highlighted the fact that the sort of current context of the Trump administration and its questioning of the NATO relationship doesn't have to be. And they've already proven that through the types of collaboration and commitment that we saw prior, carrying on from administration, whether or not it's a Democratic or Republican administration. These are about values, American values that we share. The last thing I'll touch on, and I may not be able to get your answer, but I'll try to do so in writing. The point I want to make here is that it's really essential that NATO maintain a unified position against the threat of Russia and their new partners. I have questions about Turkey in this moment. And if you could briefly, how should the United States and NATO approach member nations who are maintaining those ties with Russia that imperil the strength of the NATO relationship?
Well, Turkey is an important but complicated ally in the alliance. The U.S. needs to work with Turkey where our interests coincide, but in cases where we're at odds, we have to approach them with honesty and work through our differences, whether it's inside the alliance or in our bilateral relationship or in their relationship with Russia. I will say on Ukraine in that first year in 2022, Turkey played an important role in trying to bring the parties together. We've recently seen renewed efforts to do so, welcoming both Ukrainians and Russians back to Turkey to hopefully negotiate.
And hopefully that's the trend line that we see continue. With that, I yield back.
And that